The last moments of freedom. The guy ran as hard as he could towards Baker Street. It was his only chance. He was about half an hour away from arrest. The police drones had already tracked him. But he had to try. He didn't kill. Dear friends, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's very important. Thank you very much. Sherlock Holmes was comfortably ensconced in his modern office on Baker Street, and nothing seemed to portend alarm. The room looked simple but stylish. Instead of piles of books and documents, there were neatly laid out tablets and laptops on the shelves. In the corner, there was a large screen on which Holmes periodically displayed images from surveillance cameras, case records, and maps. In one corner of the room, there was a blackboard with photographs, diagrams and notes connected by threads of different colors. The board, however, seemed almost a theatrical detail. Holmes could have replaced it with an interactive panel, but preferred visibility. His laptop was on the table next to his smartphone and a cup of black coffee. Dr. Watson was sitting on the couch, looking through articles on his tablet. He was engrossed in reading about the latest medical innovations. The soft morning silence penetrated the room until they were interrupted by the sound of a sharp, panicked knock on the door. Both men looked up, and Watson immediately realized that they had come to them on urgent business. The door flew open and a young man ran into the room, almost falling on the threshold. He looked to be no more than 30, with disheveled hair and a look full of horror. He was barely catching his breath and clutching his smartphone tightly in his hands, as if it was the only thing that kept him from panicking. It was John Hector McFarlane, a young lawyer known in narrow circles for his honesty and extraordinary approach to cases. "Mr. Holmes," McFarlane gasped, unable to hide the tremor in his voice. "I need your help." "Me?" "I'm accused of murder. I saw it on the news." He looked frantically at the smartphone screen. "They've already written about me, like I'm a criminal. I don't understand how this is possible." Holmes nodded and motioned McFarlane to a chair in front of his desk. The young lawyer sat down with difficulty, wiping sweat from his forehead, and tried to control his breathing. "Calm down, Mr. McFarlane," Holmes said with cool confidence. "I'm sure we can help you. But first, tell me everything in order." McFarlane nodded and closed his eyes, as if gathering his thoughts, and then spoke. "A man came to my office, Mr. Oldacre. Rich, but a little weird. We didn't know each other, but he knew about me. He said that he had been following my career for a long time and that he wanted to make a will. He decided to leave me." McFarlane paused, holding back a shudder. "To leave me his entire fortune." Dr. Watson frowned. "And it didn't seem strange to you? Why did he choose you?" McFarlane lowered his head. "It seemed, but he was convincing. I even decided to make a video recording of our conversation on my phone to record his words. Now I understand that he could have set it all up to set me up, but then I had no reason to doubt. He was calm and behaved like a man who really wants to help someone in front of his, by death." "And when exactly did you find out about the accusation?" Holmes asked. "This morning. I turned on my phone and saw a message from my colleague." McFarlane handed Holmes the phone, which had an open news site. "He sent me a link to the news." His fingers were shaking. "It said that Mr. Oldacre died in a fire in his house, and I was supposedly the last person to see him. The police claim that they have evidence. The cameras recorded me on the doorstep of his house." Holmes glanced at the screen and studied the article, where a photo of McFarlane was displayed next to the headline shouting about his possible involvement in the murder. His face has already spread on social networks and turned into an object of heated discussion. "Did the cameras fix it, you say?" Holmes remarked. "Interesting. It can play against you as well as for you. But as I understand it, are you sure that you are innocent?" McFarlane sat up abruptly. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. I didn't kill him. I just came to finish the paperwork and left right away. I didn't suspect anything." Holmes studied him, and the corners of his lips twitched slightly. "All right," he nodded. "I'm going to need your full cooperation to figure out exactly where Mr. Oldacre most likely made a mistake, and how he hoped to set you up." "Doctor," Holmes said to Watson, "I think this case interests both of us." "Of course, Holmes," Watson nodded. What exactly are you interested in first? First of all, Mr. McFarlane, show me the very recording of Mr. Oldacre's video message on which he confirmed his intentions to leave his inheritance to you. I believe it is stored on your smartphone. Sometimes even the smallest details, pauses, gestures, casual glances, can tell you more than direct speech. McFarlane opened his smartphone again and, selecting the desired file, handed the phone to Holmes. In the video, Mr. Oldacre, a solid man in his 50s with a tired face, spoke in a calm tone. He explained his decision to leave everything to the young lawyer, describing him as a man who understands life and is always ready to help. Holmes followed the smallest details with interest, and when the recording ended, his gaze was focused. "Interesting," he said finally, handing the phone to McFarlane. "Everything seems to be here. Overly elaborate. It was as if he was preparing this recording as an alibi. It seems our Mr. Oldacre is not that simple. We'll have to figure out where and how he was going to make everyone believe you were guilty." McFarlane nodded, still panicking. "Mr. Holmes, I hope for your help. If I get arrested, it will be the end of my career, and, even worse, my life." Holmes, without flinching, slightly raised an eyebrow and said firmly, "I don't think we're going to let that happen, Mr. McFarlane." Sherlock Holmes was staring at the screen of his laptop, where the latest news and social media posts were open. McFarlane's story had already spread around London, and discussions were only gaining momentum. Hashtags with his name have become the most trending. Thousands of users shared their opinions, condemning or defending the young lawyer. Surveillance videos began to leak online, and in each new post they discussed the allegedly irrefutable evidence of his guilt. "Watson," Holmes said, without taking his eyes off the screen, "it seems that our client today has already become an internet celebrity." Dr. Watson put down his tablet and looked closely at McFarlane, who was sitting in an armchair and twitching his hands convulsively. He looked absolutely shattered. "John," Watson said softly, "you should calm down. The psychological state will now play an important role. If it's not your fault, and I'm sure it is, then Holmes will find a way to prove it." McFarlane opened his mouth to reply, but at that moment the office door burst open with a bang. Inspector Lestrade stood in the doorway, short, sharp-featured, in a modern gray suit and with a clipboard in his hands. He looked pleased, as if he had just caught a big fish. "Ah, Holmes, one step ahead as always," Lestrade chuckled, but his smile quickly faded when he noticed McFarlane. "Well, since you're here, Mr. McFarlane, this will make it easier for you. John Hector McFarlane, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of John Oldacre." McFarlane turned pale, but tried to stand up. "This is a mistake, Inspector. I didn't do anything." He almost screamed, his voice piercing the room. Lestrade chuckled and held up his tablet, showing the video. "A mistake, you say? The surveillance camera at Oldacre's house recorded that you were the last person to enter the house before the fire. Here, take a look." A video played on the tablet screen, a dark evening, Oldacre's house, and McFarlane standing at the door and clearly discussing something with the owner of the house. McFarlane then goes inside, and a few minutes later the door closes again. This ends the recording. "And what is this?" Lestrade asked, looking up at Holmes. "You can see for yourself. It's hard not to notice who was the last person to enter the house, and then there was a fire." Holmes leaned back in his chair and studied the video carefully. He pressed pause, turned the recording back a couple of seconds, and started it again. Then he repeated this action several times, narrowing his eyes in concentration. "Tell me, Lestrade," Holmes said slowly, "why is the last minute missing from the video before the fire? Where is the recording from the cameras inside the house? I'm sure Oldacre had a video surveillance system that covered more than just the facade." Lestrade rolled his eyes. "Ah, Holmes, you always complicate things. Yes, the recording inside the house is allegedly damaged, probably because of the fire. But what we have is already enough. We found a knife with traces of McFarlane's sweat on it, as well as the victim's blood on it. It was with this knife that the murder was committed. McFarlane allegedly burned or hid the body itself. We have yet to find out this during his interrogation. And then McFarlane started a fire to hide the evidence. And what's more, we have analytical data from the new app. It analyzes the behavior of suspects based on video recordings. According to the algorithm, Mr. McFarlane looked suspiciously nervous and anxious. And what kind of application is this? Watson interjected, genuinely surprised. This is the latest development of the department. Lestrade was clearly pleased with himself. Artificial intelligence analyzes facial expressions and behavior, captures facial expressions and intonation. In this case, the application confidently indicates a high risk of guilt. Holmes chuckled and inclined his head slightly. So now we arrest people based on the evidence of algorithms? Do you really think they are as reliable as ordinary deduction? What don't you like? Lestrade snorted. Technological progress does not stand still, Holmes. We are moving forward, and technology is helping us solve crimes faster. We have video footage, algorithms, analytics, all the evidence against him. Holmes paused for a moment, contemplating Lestrade thoughtfully, then turned to McFarlane, who looked completely broken. Mr. McFarlane, Holmes said quietly, are you saying that you left the house immediately after talking to Oldacre? Yes, Mr. Holmes, I swear. I just handed him the documents and we discussed the terms of the will. No quarrels, no threats. I do not know what happened next. Lestrade sighed heavily. I'm sorry, Mr. McFarlane, but the news has already spread on the internet. People demand justice. We have the evidence, and I have to act. You'll have to come with me. Holmes got up from the table and walked over to McFarlane, putting his hand on his shoulder. Don't worry, John. It's not over yet. I'm sure there's something here that we're missing. Trust me. Yes, Holmes, chuckled Lestrade, as always trying to find excuses. But this time the case is closed. The evidence speaks for itself, and if you have nothing else to say, then I'm taking it away. McFarlane stood up, his face gray with horror, but he managed to look at Holmes with sadness and hope. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, he said before the inspector handcuffed him and led him out of the office. The door slammed shut, and Holmes froze for a moment, lost in thought. Then, wasting no time, he turned to Watson. Watson, we need to act quickly. This video is most likely a fake. I have some inconsistencies. It was as if someone had cut out a piece of the recording and replaced it with other fragments. And even more interesting is that the recording appeared on the network before the police published it. This means that we have a case not only with the killer, but also with someone who wants to stir up a scandal. Now we have to figure out who did it and why. Holmes and Watson quickly left the office on Baker Street and headed towards Norwood, an area known for its opulent mansions and green parks. London seemed quiet and peaceful on this cool day, but Holmes's inner tension was palpable. Watson watched him, noticing how his friend periodically checks messages on his smartphone and enters something into his laptop, which was on his lap in a taxi. Holmes, Watson began cautiously, I see that you have already begun your investigation. What are you looking for? Right now, Watson, I'm checking the latest updates from the area's CCTV system. Holmes replied, without looking up from the screen. These cameras installed on the streets of Norwood provide access to the city's general surveillance network. All I need to do is find those records that could have been tampered with or distorted. But that's illegal, Watson said, glancing back at the taxi driver. Holmes chuckled. Legally or not, Watson, this is the only way to get to the truth. Sometimes, to catch a criminal, you have to circumvent the rules. The taxi stopped in front of Oldacre's large modern mansion. The house was surrounded by a high fence with metal gates, on which CCTV cameras were visible. The building looked empty and lifeless after the fire. The windows were boarded up, and the smell of burning was still in the air. Look, Watson, Holmes said, pointing to the camera above the gate. Oldacre's smart home was equipped with an advanced security system. Surprisingly, the police claim that some of the footage from the cameras was damaged by the fire. What do you mean? Watson frowned. The fire started on the ground floor, but the servers were in the basement. They couldn't have been hit by the fire so quickly. This indicates a possible intentional interference. Holmes walked over to the gate and quickly connected to the central control unit via his tablet. Watson was surprised to see how easily Holmes bypassed the security system. How did you do it? He asked, impressed. All modern smart home systems have backup access for technical support, Holmes explained, quickly scrolling through the data on the screen. If you know where to look, you can find a way to connect. Here, I'm in the system. A diagram of the house with cameras and sensors connected appeared on the screen. Holmes began reviewing the footage from the cameras, starting from the moment when McFarlane came to the house. "Here he is, our young lawyer." Holmes pointed to the footage from the front camera. "But look, the video is interrupted. The frames seem to be replaced and then the camera turns off. This is not an accident, but an interference with the video stream," Holmes explained. Watson stared intently at the screen, trying to comprehend what he saw. "But who could have done it, and why?" he asked. "That's what we have to find out," Holmes said. "But the most curious thing is that after the failure, the camera turns on again, and the drone is visible on the recording, taking off from the territory of the house. This could be a routine observation, if not for one thing. After takeoff, the drone disappears from the field of view of all cameras. Are you saying that someone controlled the drone to hide important details?" Watson seemed stunned. "That's right," Holmes nodded. "Drones in smart homes are usually programmed to patrol the territory and transmit the recording directly to the server. If the drone disappeared from view and did not return, it means that it was taken with them. This may indicate that the drone was used to record additional evidence or to manipulate the video." "But how do we find this drone?" Watson asked. Holmes returned to his tablet, sorting through the data. Each drone used in the smart home system is connected to the internet and has a unique identifier. In addition, all home drones operating in residential areas must be registered. I can trace when and where he last connected to the network. And here's the data. The drone was disabled just a few kilometers away, in an industrial area near Norwood. Watson raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Do you think that the drone is hidden somewhere there?" "Very likely, Watson, and if we find it, we can restore the records that could have been deleted or replaced." I saved his coordinates. Next, Holmes and Watson decided to explore the house. The mansion looked ominous. Black fire spots on the walls, broken windows, and the remains of charred door frames. The firefighters had finished their work long ago, and now the house was blocked by the police. However, Holmes, as always, found a way around the restrictions. "Watson, we have a very important part of the work ahead of us. I am sure that this crime scene was carefully staged, but let's see what's left behind the scenes," Holmes said, pulling a small electronic device out of his pocket. "What is it?" Watson asked, surprised by the unusual device. "It's a portable scanner for detecting traces of chemicals," Holmes explained. "If there was arson here, then I will be able to find remnants of combustible materials, as well as traces of a smoke bomb or fireworks." They entered the house, carefully avoiding debris and burnt pieces of furniture. Holmes began to scan the floor, walls, and ceiling, while carefully examining everything around. "Look here, Watson." Holmes pointed to the corner of the room where the charred remains lay. "There's something unusual here." He crouched down and took out a pair of tweezers from his toolbox, carefully removing a small piece of plastic from the ashes. "It's part of a smoke bomb," he said, looking at the find under a magnifying glass. "A typical way to create artificial smoke and mask a real crime scene." Watson leaned closer to examine the find. "But why would anyone want to start an artificial fire? This is not a real disaster, but a production." "Exactly, Watson. It was staged. I suspected this from the very beginning when I found out about the failures in the video surveillance system. Someone wanted to create the illusion of a fire, distracting attention from the real evidence." And please note, Holmes pointed to the pieces of charred cardboard. "Fireworks were used here to create flashes of fire. That explains why the firefighters didn't find any signs of heavy burning," Watson said. "Goren. But why all this?" Holmes thought for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Let's take a look at the video surveillance system again. If the fire was fake, then the recording, which the police consider evidence, may also be falsified." They went down to the basement to the server room. Holmes connected to the server and began analyzing the video recordings. The footage flashed. McFarlane enters the house, the doors close, a malfunction occurs, and the video ends. "Look, Watson." Holmes zoomed in on the image. "Pay attention to the shadows. When McFarlane walks in, the shadow moves to the right, but seconds later its direction changes. This proves that part of the record has been replaced." "Are you saying that this is a deepfake?" Watson was stunned. "Yes, and quite skilled. Deepfake technologies allow you to change not only faces but also human behavior. But at the same time, it is difficult to preserve the naturalness of all details, such as shadows. Holmes switched to another already familiar fragment of the video, where a drone was seen rising above the house. The drone suddenly disappeared from the frame. As I said, this is another proof of the production. The drone was supposed to record everything that happened, but someone took it with them to hide the evidence. This confirms that the drone operator was nearby. How do we find the operator? Not all at once. First, we need to find the drone, my dear friend. Now we know where to look for him. Holmes said with a slight smile. But who could have organized all this? Someone who wanted to frame McFarlane. Everything indicates that Oldacre was involved in this plan himself, but it is quite possible that he needed help. Someone who understands deepfake technologies and knows how to hack systems. They were about to go up to the first floor when Holmes froze for a second, paying attention to the barely noticeable footprints on the floor. "And what is this?" Watson asked, following his gaze. "Boot marks. They lead to the back entrance and are too fresh for firefighters or police. Someone has been here recently, probably to remove evidence." Holmes went to the door and opened it. Outside, the air was saturated with the smell of burning and chemicals. "They used an acetone smoke bomb here," Holmes frowned. "Someone disguised their visit as the aftermath of the fire." "But who?" Watson repeated. "We'll find out, Watson. And now we are going to the industrial zone. Our next clue awaits us there." Holmes strode confidently forward, leaving behind an empty but full of secrets Oldacre mansion. Holmes and Watson reached the industrial area. Surrounded by old warehouses and abandoned buildings, this part of London seemed completely deserted. Holmes looked at the screen of his smartphone, where the dot of the drone's last signal was flashing. "Here," Holmes pointed to an old brick building, the last place where the drone signal was registered. They went inside. The dusty room was filled with old furniture, empty boxes, and piles of garbage. Holmes quickly found the drone hidden under a pile of rags. He examined it and connected it to his laptop. "Watson, take a look," Holmes said, showing the screen. The recording from this drone contains key footage that was deleted from the main surveillance system of Oldacre's house. A new recording appeared on the screen. Oldacre leaves through the back door, holding a small suitcase in his hands. He looks around and, after walking a few meters, disappears around the corner. "Oldacre is alive," Watson concluded, but why would he fake his own death? Holmes looked at the recording thoughtfully. "It's a classic scheme," he said. "I believe that Oldacre faked his death in order to escape with the money and get rid of all financial obligations. But it takes more than just disappearing to pull this off. He needed offshore accounts and fake documents." Watson nodded, understanding what Holmes was getting at. He used digital payment systems to transfer money to accounts registered in fictitious names. This explains why the police did not find any traces of financial fraud. All transfers were disguised as ordinary transactions. "That's right, Watson," Holmes agreed, getting up from his chair. "But there's one detail that Oldacre did not foresee. The modern digital tracking system leaves traces even where he thought he was safe. I checked his transactions and found several suspicious transfers to offshore accounts in Panama and Seychelles." "But how did you do it?" Watson couldn't hide his surprise. "I used an analytical tool, a program that checks for anomalies in payment systems," Holmes explained. "Oldacre made the mistake of transferring a large sum to a new account immediately after the fire. This aroused suspicion in the banking system and left a digital footprint. They left the industrial building and headed back to the Oldacre mansion." Holmes was focused and talking on the phone as they drove. "I called my friend from the Secret Service. It all fits together, my dear Watson. Oldacre ordered forged documents in the name of Gregor Jefferson. Obviously, he was planning to leave the country under a new identity." When Holmes and Watson returned to the Oldacre mansion, they were already armed with new data. Holmes checked Oldacre's recent transactions and made sure that a significant amount of money had been transferred to an offshore bank account. This indicated that Oldacre was planning to escape, but was delayed somewhere. Holmes was sure that Oldacre was still in the house. They entered the dark corridor of the mansion again. This time, Holmes was focused on his smartphone, scrolling through recordings and connecting to the smart home system. "Watson, pay attention to the control panel," Holmes said, pointing to the touchscreen in the hall. "Here you can control the entire system of the house. Lights, cameras, locks. But there's something that makes me suspicious." "What is it exactly?" Watson asked, watching Holmes's rapid movements. "There are rooms recorded in the system that should not be there. I noticed this when we hacked the video surveillance, but I didn't pay attention. Now, however, I realize that this may be a hidden room." Holmes took out a portable thermal imager and began scanning the house. An infrared image appeared on the screen. Most of the rooms had only faint traces of heat left by firefighters and police officers. But in one corner of the house, under the kitchen, Holmes noticed an anomaly, a strong heat source that clearly did not correspond to the empty space. "Here it is, Watson," Holmes said, showing the screen. "There should be a basement here. Do you see this bright spot? It's too warm for an ordinary basement, especially after a fire. There's obviously someone there." They went to the kitchen, where Holmes examined the floor and walls again. This time, he connected to the smart home system via his laptop. "What are you doing, Holmes?" Watson was surprised, watching his friend's work. "This system includes motion sensors and temperature control. It is connected to the internet, and, as you know, it can be hacked with sufficient knowledge and time," Holmes replied without looking up from the screen. "I got access to the sensors. Now let's see what they show us." Sensor data appeared on the screen. Holmes immediately noticed that one of the motion sensors in the far corner of the basement had been activated recently. "Someone's moving down there, Watson, and they're definitely not rats," Holmes chuckled. "It looks like that's where our old friend Oldacre hid." Holmes walked over to the wall and began to examine it carefully. He clicked on a few tiles and then activated a hidden button. At that moment, there was a barely audible click, and part of the wall shifted, revealing a narrow passage to the basement. "You amaze me, Holmes," Watson said, shaking his head. "How did you find this?" "It's simple," Holmes replied, going down the stairs. "Modern technologies give us tools that can be used both for crimes and for their detection. Oldacre relied too much on his smart home system, but he didn't take into account that I could access it. The secret part of the basement turned out to be small but well equipped. The walls were lined with soundproof panels, and in the corner there was a table with a computer and several suitcases of money. There were fake documents and plane tickets on the floor. Oldacre himself was sitting in the center of the room, startled and stunned by the sudden appearance of Holmes and Watson. "I think I started seeing dead people." "Well, Mr. Oldacre," Holmes said with a slight grin, "your little hiding place has not turned out to be so reliable." Oldacre looked up and tried to keep his cool. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. "I happened to be here by accident, just trying to survive the chaos after the fire." "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about," Holmes replied, gesturing at the suitcases with the money. "You faked your death to hide from creditors and avoid responsibility. You used deepfake technology to fake camera footage and hired a hacker to hack into the surveillance system. But your mistake was that you underestimated the capabilities of modern analytics and monitoring." "You can't prove it," Oldacre said desperately, glancing at the documents. "On the contrary," Holmes retorted, showing the data on his laptop. "I have access to all your transfers to offshore accounts. In addition, recordings from your own drone contain footage of you leaving the house through the back door after a staged fire. You're damned crooks. You are unfairly accusing me. You can't prove anything." Oldacre tried to say something else, but Watson interrupted him. "It's no use, Oldacre. Everything has already been revealed. You faked your death, hid in your own house, and planned to flee the country under a new identity. But Holmes was one step ahead again. You bequeathed MacFarlane only a small portion of your estate in order to deceive the police and put them on the wrong track." At that moment, Inspector Lestrade appeared in the basement with a group of policemen. "Nice work, Holmes," Lestrade said, cuffing Oldacre. "It was one of the most difficult cases, but you found all the answers again." Holmes nodded, smiling slightly. "Sometimes all evidence is hidden from view, Lestrade, but if you know where to look, the truth becomes obvious." Oldacre was taken out of the basement, and Holmes and Watson were left alone. Watson looked at his friend with admiration. "That was brilliant, Holmes. But tell me, how did you know that Oldacre was here in the basement?" "Everything pointed to that, my dear Watson," Holmes replied. "His financial transactions, false documents, as well as excessive use of the smart home system. He built his hideout in the hope that no one would be able to find him. But modern technology does not only work for those who use it for criminal purposes. As the saying goes, if you want to hide something, put it in a prominent place." They left the house, where they were greeted by the cool evening air. London was sinking into twilight, and Holmes walked lightly along the sidewalk, humming something to himself. After Oldacre's arrest, Holmes and Watson went to the police station, where McFarlane was still in the pretrial detention cell. He was depressed, but when he saw Holmes, his face lit up with a faint hope. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "what happened?" "Will I be released?" "Yes, Mr. McFarlane," Holmes replied, opening the camera. "You are free." "We exposed Oldacre, and all the evidence of his guilt was handed over to the police. Moreover, the news of his confession is already spreading in the media. Your reputation has been restored, and the case will be closed soon." McFarlane could hardly believe his ears. "I do not know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes," he said, shaking the detective's hand. "You saved my life." "No need to thank you, Mr. McFarlane," Holmes replied with a slight smile. "Just be careful in the future when you make deals with people like Oldacre." They left the police station and Holmes breathed in the fresh London air. "Well, Watson, one more thing is completed," he said, glancing at his watch. "And now I think we should go home. I feel like we have a lot of work to do." "But you've just solved a complicated case, Holmes," Watson said, following his friend. "Maybe we should take a break?" "A break?" Holmes laughed. "My dear Watson, crimes don't take a break, which means we are too." And with that, they headed for a taxi to return to their apartment on Baker Street. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Baker Street office was lively and joyful. Holmes and Watson were sitting at the table, drinking tea and discussing the latest developments. Watson was happily reading the latest comments on his blog, and Holmes, propping his chin on his hand, was watching the news about Oldacre's exposure, which had already gone viral on social networks. "Your blog exploded, Watson," Holmes remarked with a slight grin, without looking up from the screen. "It seems our little investigation has caused quite a stir." "Yes, Holmes," Watson replied, adjusting his glasses. "People are delighted, but I still can't believe it all ended so quickly. Comments just flooded my blog. Everyone wants to know more details." There was a knock on the office door, and without waiting for an answer, Inspector Lestrade entered the room. There was embarrassment and discomfort on his face. Holmes turned around and greeted him with a grin. "Inspector Lestrade, I'm glad to see you. I didn't expect you to come so soon." "Holmes, Watson," Lestrade began, scratching his head and looking away. "I have come to apologize. I was too sure I was right and arrested an innocent man. If it weren't for you, McFarlane would be in jail right now." "It can happen to anyone, Lestrade," Holmes said, getting up from the table and approaching the inspector. "But it is important to admit your mistakes and correct them. McFarlane is already free and safe. And as for Oldacre, he has a long conversation with the court." Lestrade sighed and nodded. "Yes, I've already talked to McFarlane. He accepted my apology, although I can see that my trust in me has been severely undermined. He said he didn't know how he would have coped if it hadn't been for you." Holmes nodded slightly, and a spark of pride flashed in his eyes. "Justice has been done, Lestrade," he said, "and that's the main thing." Thanks for listening to this detective story to the end. If you liked it, please like this video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much. See you soon.